Canada, setting up an Aboriginal business culture around their, or First Nation as they call it in Canada, business culture around their operations. The idea here is to address social needs, start from these needs, but address them in a way that at the same time generates profit. Now we will have a lot of example and discussion around these various types today, and it is also important to see that some players over time have moved from philanthropy, for instance, to missionary. You see it with many big organizations that once you get involved in this space, you apply your business rationale in the way how you engage with communities and address these issues. The question, though, then remains: will this stay? And this is probably my main area of research. And the thing really here is that we have seen over the last 30 years a shift in responsibilities from government to private business. And the reasons are very simple. Globalization is one issue. What Australian mining companies do in PNG and other parts of the world, this cannot be addressed directly by the Australian government. So the expectation has turned to business quite a bit. Institutional failure: governments are good at wealth distribution. They have big troubles in allocating risks. Just think of the debate on the carbon tax here in Australia recently. It's a very thorny issue for politicians who need re-election, consent of the business community every 4 years. And of course, some policies, economic policies, such as liberalization and deregulation of markets over the last 30 years have shifted more responsibility to the private sector. Is this going to change? If we look at the key drivers, we can say, no, it's not going to change. It's actually going to grow. We see an increase, and that would be the market argument, in markets governing societies. After the fall of the Iron Curtain, with the liberalization of India, the opening of China, we see that markets become the key way of governing economies and societies. And with that, corporate responsibility as big market players for these wider issues is just going to grow. The citizenship argument, I remind you of that definition by the Unilever CEO. People in their aspirations as citizens turn increasingly not to governments but to private corporations for things like water, health, air quality, education, and other commodities. In our countries, but more pronounced even in so-called emerging or developing countries. And finally, of course, we can also put in the democracy argument, which is a fairly recent driver of CSR, which came up after the so-called financial crisis, where we have seen that the basic mechanism to support middle classes as a fundamental condition of a lively democracy has been threatened very much by the events of the financial crisis. And governments, if we look to Greece and most other governments in the world who are heavily indebted, will not be able to provide these mechanisms any longer. The markets have let us down. If you think of home ownership or pensions benefits, which are in jeopardy for a lot of people who have over the last years invested in these private forms of middle class security, there's the growing demand that the private sector corporations will have to step in. So in that sense, all factors point in a direction that this debate about how corporations address social issues and address them in a new form which makes business sense at the same time as it addresses social issues is here to stay. The key success factors in many ways is top management, buy-in and leadership. Many of these issues are not traditional issues. It took Coca-Cola 30 years to accept that water provision and water management is actually a business issue for them. It definitely asks for a long-term focus, And of course, a new social competency to engage with non-traditional stakeholders, as of course many of you who do these things day by day will know. The interesting thing is that this asks for new challenges. If you take on issues like health, education, crime prevention, community building, which for a long time the expectations have been pointing to governments, similar demands for transparency and accountability come up. And in particular, it will ask for new ways of transcending bureaucratic structures in which corporations, of course, work, in order to address and to engage with new constituencies of stakeholders. But what we definitely can say, and I think this nicely dovetails out into today's discussion, is that we can see emerging, and will see more of it and share hopefully a lot of it today, new models of value delivery for companies, and in particular also new markets of value creation and revenue generations for corporations. And with that, I would pass it on to Paul.
Thank you for saying that. Thanks very much for that, and particularly highlighting the way in which companies now are seeing CSR and sustainability as a new opportunity. I mean, there was a recent publication that came out from the UN Secretary General's Global Panel on Sustainability that highlighted the fact that this was the best and worst of times in terms of the big challenges facing us. We've got unprecedented wealth, but at the same time unprecedented ecological and social challenges. And one of the things they've highlighted there, I think, was that I think by 2030 we're going to need 50% more food, we're going to need 45% more energy, we're going to need 30% more fresh water, but we're going to have to do that respecting the existing boundaries. Now, one of the questions I'd like to ask you on behalf of the audience, we'll have time for one question after that, is when you come to a country like Australia, or from Canada, or indeed companies that are operating in Africa, often you hear of the notion of a resource curse, you know, where a country is blessed, it's a lucky country, it's got a lot of resources, but that can sometimes have a negative impact on the country's capacity or desire to innovate because things are going so well. So here's a bit of a hard question for you to liven things up a bit. What do you see from your experience in Canada or even in Australia in terms of that conflict between a resource curse that enables you to actually have a robust economy, as we have here, and its capacity to innovate or not? Are there any observations that you have, say, from Canada?
I think Canada and Australia in that sense are similar, that they're blessed with a rich stock of resources. And the challenge, of course, in that situation is how to keep more of the value chain in the country. And this is a social issue, of course, because creating, for instance, manufacturing jobs, which deal with adding value before the commodities are exported, are mostly lower and middle class jobs. And this is, of course, a very, as I briefly mentioned, a very big challenge in many Western countries, certainly in Canada. And I think social innovation here, which would at the same time be great business opportunities, would look at creating a sector which keeps more of the value chain of these commodities in the country. That can be, of course, with minerals, but also there's no reason why I have to buy Italian branded spaghettis in Australia. Why is there not a bigger branding, apart from Foster's and the wine industry, I have to say, of agricultural products in Australia, a country which has such a rich abundance of these things, but also a great quality of it? Why is it that Argentinian steaks are sold in the steakhouses of London and New York, but not Australian ones? There's no real reason. Innovation in terms of branding this country would be an innovation of social benefit, but also a clear-cut business proposition.
Great, thanks. One burning question for Dirk. Yes, gentlemen here. We have a microphone, please. And we'll get to more questions later, but I'd just like to manage time now.
Trevor Johnson from the Warehouse in New Zealand. I wonder if you could comment a little bit. You mentioned briefly the Apple scenario recently when they've been targeted by NGOs and activists around the supply chain practices. I've been following that quite closely. I'm personally very familiar with the supply chain in China in many different categories, and it seems to me that particular issue really cuts into a lot of the themes you've been addressing in your presentation. I mean, here we have a highly innovative company that's delivering tremendous social value, is profiting tremendous profits. The share price just spiked dramatically over the last 3 or 4 weeks, and yet it's been targeted for poor practices in its supply chain, by the media, by NGOs and so forth, when in fact my estimate is that it's actually pretty much best in class for sourcing in China. And yet there's another piece in there that links to your theme, which is where's the Chinese government? Why aren't people targeting the Chinese government? You talked before about governments being unable to fulfill some of their social responsibilities, and yet corporates are actually being called to account to fill some of these gaps. So I wonder if you could develop on these things a little bit. Thank you.
2 things. The first thing, of course, is that Apple now is, in valuation, the biggest company in the world. And that draws a different type of attention. It draws the attention and the expectations, as I said, hitherto placed on governments. That's just a fact. The second, of course, is that Apple was always considered as the good company, and when Steve Jobs died, I don't know if you remember the worldwide commemorations and condolences, he was the one who took us as customers first. I mean, we are all pretty much governed by one monopolist who doesn't treat us exactly very well in the IT, in the software world, and now comes Apple and produces these really ergonomic, easy products. So there was a lot of goodwill here towards this company. But with growing to that extent, what we see is that the expectations shift. Now we can say, is this right? You rightly asked for the Chinese government, but the reality is that the expectation to the Chinese government will not be fulfilled. The solution will not come from there, at least not medium term. And therefore, by default, it ends up with the corporation. Now we can say, is this right? Should we not go back to a post-Walled Keynesian world where government, civil society, and markets were neatly separated and kids could still sleep quietly in their beds at night? But that's not our world anymore. The expectation is on Apple, and a company which is the most profitable in the world is then measured against the way how they treat all stakeholders which contribute to that value generation. And we might have different information, but if you look at the way Apple has treated its Chinese factories and monitored, that is clearly wanting, and even the approach announced yesterday still leaves big question marks here.
Okay, great. Thank you very much indeed, Dirk.